Hello, my name is Luke Simon, and this is my ES-40 final product, which is going to be a deep dive into the human connection with trees. It's just going to be audio. I tried getting a webcam working, it didn't work, so I'm sorry about that. It will just be audio in the presentation here. So the central questions for this lecture and this presentation is going to be, is there a natural and complex connection between humans and trees? And how will deforestation affect this connection, if it does exist, culturally, mentally, and physically? So, if you kind of thought to yourself, you know, if you were asked the question, what connection do humans have with trees? What would your answer be? Um, and I asked that to a few of my friends and colleagues, and the responses I got back were pretty basic. So they provide oxygen and we provide carbon dioxide. We plant the trees and they provide us with their wood. They provide us with shelter and shade, even something as they look nice, or if you're getting a little more scientific, they act as important carbon sinks. These are all true, and these all very much promote a symbiotic relationship with trees, which is, of course, if we go back to our question, very different than what we're talking about here. We're wondering, is there a natural and complex connection? Now that's more than just symbiotic. Sure, it's natural, um, but a lot of this is suggesting that we give trees something, they give us something. That's it. Very surface level. We have a relationship with that, with everything. That's what we have with friends sometimes. Maybe not very good friends, but we have that relationship with friends. So moving on, we're going to kind of look at this through what I'm calling three spheres of interest, or the three ways that we will explore human connection. And those are, the first one is mental connection. So the most modern, this is kind of one of the most modern explorations of human connections. Something we've been kind of going through in more recent times. And because of that, we are still learning a lot about mental connection in general and mental connection with trees. Kind of the main point here is trees, and furthermore, exposure to trees are directly related to our mental health and have measurable impacts on multiple different aspects. That's what we're looking for human connection through like mental aspects. So kind of do trees do this? Do they have these connections? And mental connection is the most interconnected of the three. Oftentimes drawing the line between mental and physical connection can be difficult, as we're going to go on and see. A lot of things that have you may think have mental connections also kind of have physical implications to them. And it's really interesting to kind of see how they interact and the connection that they have between each other. Physical connection. This is kind of the closest that we have to our base level symbiotic relationship with trees. Obviously, you say trees providing oxygen for us. That is a very, very physical connection. We need oxygen to live. We need oxygen to breathe. It's about as physical as it gets, I'd say. But importantly, do trees have a deeper physical relationship with humans that can be observed on the surface than can be observed on the surface? Trees do affect our health. That's true. We'll go into that a little bit later, but it is true. And in fact, exposure to nature has a whole host of physical health benefits that we will go through in just a second. And the third, this is the most, I say least scientific here. And I don't mean that in the sense of like it's not science. It's very qualitative, which is most certainly science. But it's the least hard science. We're going to talk a lot about, physical things that you can observe in the last ones. We're talking about, um, you know, stress and oxygen and stuff like that, which is very, very, very scientific. It's very, there's numbers and you can observe these things quantitatively, and there's definitely like, biology and that kind of thing involved in there. Cultural connection doesn't really talk about biology or who we are as humans or who trees are as beings. It's a lot more about, what we can observe in history and stuff like that. It's the most broad definition of connection. So culture is going to encompass human relationships, religious beliefs, spiritual beliefs, and trees as a part of our culture and our society. Importantly, religion versus spirituality is an important thing to kind of go over here. Religion is a system of faith and worship, something like Christianity, Judaism, Islam, stuff like that. Spirituality is the belief that there's something greater than the self. So this could be a little more related to something like Buddhism, or you can be very much spiritual without being religious. They are independent of each other. Obviously, religion may draw on spirituality, but spirituality does not have to draw on religion. Again, in that case of Buddhism, which doesn't have a god or anything like that. So let's go first into our mental connection. So the first kind of question here is, do humans have mental connection with trees? Simple answer to this is yeah, we do. But it's very difficult to measure the individual impacts of trees on mental health. We can observe these changes that happen when we're around trees, but kind of saying that on an individual level and connecting that directly to trees can be very, very difficult. And again, I talked about this a little earlier. This is a new field of study. A lot of the journals that we are going to talk about here are published in more recent years, and there's a lot coming out on this topic to this day. There's books being written about this. There's journals coming out, as I say there. There's research being done on this actively right now. So some of the information presented in this portion will change, and it's just part of the process. And again, here, qualitative analysis will be important. I talked about that a little bit in the spiritual aspect. It is also very important in the mental aspect. So the first kind of study we're going to talk about, if you're going to notice, in the bottom left corner of our screen, I pointed at it. I don't know why, like I think you can see it. The bottom left corner of the screen, oops, we're going to see kind of, this one's Sturm, comma, Cohen, 2014. That's going to be the research journals we're presenting that I'm kind of talking about. Um, you can go, and if you go into the sources at the end, you can click on any of those, read through them all. But this is kind of what I'm basing some information on. Not everything in all these slides is going to be based on those studies. There's some slides that aren't going to have studies attached to them because they're just combinations of other information or, personal insight from myself, stuff like that. So let's first start off. This is going to be benefits of living near green space. Let's kind of start off with a pretty broad definition of green space. So green space is open space areas that contain grass, trees, and other green things. They're often prevalent in urban areas where untouched natural space is rare. Think Central Park in New York City or Golden Gate Park in San Francisco. Those are really, really great examples of green space. These large, large parks in San Francisco, there's a good amount of parks. But New York, if you've been to New York, you will know not a lot of green space there. But Central Park definitely is a little dystopian if you ask me, but that's beyond the point. So kind of the simple connection we can observe here is that distance to green space is directly connected to benefits on mental health. The closer one lives to a park or a green space, the better their mental health may be. So if you live, 5 minutes from a park, that could be good for your health. And again, here's a good little study here, or a little factoid. Those who live close to a park, which is less than 400 meters, that's a very, very quick walk, visit parks almost 5 times as much as those who live over a kilometer away from a park, which is 5.2 times a week compared to 1.3 times a week. And we're going to see that in the next slide as well. A nearby urban park, this is a direct quote from the journal, a nearby urban park is associated with the same mental health benefits as decreasing local unemployment rates by 2 percentage points. Again, this is back to that point I just said in the previous slide. Finding the individual parts here is difficult. Sure, we can say 5.2 times a week and 1.3. That's individual, but we can't necessarily quantify mental health on an individual basis here. It's very, very difficult. Requires these studies that need to take a very, very long amount of time and necessarily haven't been done yet. So essentially, an increased access to trees can be shown to improve mental health. We're going to see that right here. So here's one of the tables from that study. You're going to see MHI 5 refers to mental health index 5, which is like a 5-question mental health thing. Don't worry about those scores; it's not really important what we're looking at here. The things I really want to kind of focus on is the number of weekly park visits and the 4 at the bottom. So as we notice, the closer one lives to a park, the more often they are going to visit a park, which seems to make sense. We do notice here in this 800 to 1.6 kilometer range that they also are going to be visiting parks, about 4, which is definitely kind of closer to the 5.2. What I will say about that is kind of a flaw of this study. They only studied a certain amount of parks, so what this kind of suggests that they might have been going to a park that was not one of the study parks. Um, and again, we see that down the bottom. We can visit other parks as well. We see that lower when you're closer to a park and higher when you're farther from a park, which does make sense. But also we notice that poor health is actually the lowest when we get closest. That's again more physical than that any exercise and exercise minutes. But we do also notice that, you know, we do have better mental health and better, um, you know, it does help our mental health to be closer to a park and be closer to a green space, especially when we live in cities and urban areas. So there's also an idea here of greenness. So greenness is similar to the ideas of green space. And it can be seen kind of in a neighborhood. So how green a neighborhood or a public space is. To put it simply, increased greenness of a neighborhood increases physical activity of its residents. And we'll loop back to this a little bit later. Um, and the issue here is it's actually really, really, really hard to measure greenness's effect on mental health, which, you know, kind of seems silly. I'm talking about this in mental connection. It is important. Um, but greenness is something that is, it loops back to what we just said. Having more parks and more green spaces is good for your mental health in your neighborhood if you have it closer to you. But to kind of quantify how much the impact is really, really, really difficult unless we're using these very, very, the mental health index 5 is not a great way to quantify mental health. It's not perfect. So there are some connections between access to green space and improved mental health, and these connections tend to be inconsistent and incredibly hard to quantify, just as we're saying. So is there really a mental connection that we can see? I know I said at the beginning there is one, and I'm going to kind of talk about that in a second. But first, it is very, very important to note correlation versus causation is very, very important, and causation are very, very important to what we're going to talk about here. So just because we can correlate two things, just so we can correlate increased mental health and access to parks, does not mean those are directly related or cause one another. Correlation does not equal causation. So just kind of remember that throughout. It's important detail, and it kind of does play a big role in this study and why it's really, really difficult to quantify mental health from connection to trees. So nature as a healer. This is something really important to mental health. We talk about healing. I'm talking about healing kind of as a mental health practice here. So there are many cultures and practices that use natural exposure as a healer. For example, there's a common practice of outdoor yoga and meditation to decrease stress. I've done that a lot for my yoga. I started doing yoga about a few years ago, and for me, it was always kind of natural to do that outside. And I always found that was very, very, it's a very connecting thing. You feel very connected to nature. And it's part of what it kind of sparked me on this journey of discovering human connection with the outdoors and with trees, because I feel like you definitely get when you practice things like yoga and meditation, you feel a deeper connection. And, that's a not a very scientific thing there, but it's definitely something that you can feel. There's also stuff like nature therapy or exposure to nature for therapeutic reasons, and forest bathing, which is something we're going to talk about just a bit later. So this really simple question to ask here. Does the experience of being outdoors actually contribute to healing, or is it simply correlational? Sure, we can see that these practices are used to heal the soul or the mind or the spirit, but does it actually do anything? Or is this just like, hey, we do yoga outside and this helps us, or is that just the yoga? So it's a very interesting thing to think about. So let's talk about one of the specific ones here, which is forest bathing. So what is forest bathing? If you haven't heard of it before, it's a Japanese practice of immersing oneself in nature in order to alleviate stress and anxiety. So this is used a lot by business people and those that are in high stress environments in Japan. And it is actually a very, very big part of their culture and very, very important to them. So effectively, it is a meditative, aimless walk through nature that has been shown to reduce stress in those who live or work in high stress environments. Simply put, a reconnection with nature is shown to improve mental health in these cases. So some of the benefits, like the concrete benefits of forest bathing, is that it significantly decreases anxiety, it significantly decreases depression, and has a whole host of physical benefits, which again is important to later. It helps improve your mood, and it can promote higher self-esteem and what we call health-promoting behavior, which is kind of behavior like making you want to exercise more or make better life choices about what you're eating or doing to your body to promote your health. It is kind of says what it is in there, but it is definitely an important thing that we can see as a benefit from forest bathing, from doing these forest practices. So in this perspective, we can see this clear connection between human mental health and trees. There is something there. What is it? Is that between trees? Is that between the forest space? It remains to be seen. But we can definitely see here, very again, it's pretty qualitative. We can't. It's very hard to point anxiety and depression as quantitative things, as numbers on a graph that we can see. But we can kind of get this information and say, hey, doing this is good for you and it does help your mental health, and there is some form of mental connection there to being outside and to being in trees. Again, it is extremely difficult to quantify these changes in mental health numbers. We can see connections and benefits. Finding exact information is difficult, and most of it does not exist yet. Again, I wish I could go out there and do these studies. They're very, very long. It takes a lot of time to do, and they don't always provide you with kind of consistent or, you know, helpful data. And a lot of these mental-based studies simply leave room for more research to be done. We could say, hey, especially think about that forest bathing, hey, this baseline research shows that we can reduce stress, we can reduce anxiety, we can reduce depression. It really just leaves space for us to go back in there and do research on, quantifying those numbers, putting numbers to it. It's very, very, very difficult, but it could be done and could then show us a deeper mental connection. And a lot of these studies are just proving correlation, which is good. Correlation is great. We can say, well, correlation is not equal causation. Correlation a lot of times is the start. Once we correlate something, we can then try to figure out what the causation is or what is causing it. I think so. It's really very much right now the beginning of something that hopefully in the coming years we could really, really end up figuring out. So moving on, in the case of forest bathing, do mental benefits lead to physical benefits? The other way around? Are they even connected at all? That's kind of the question I want to ask you. And think about it right now. Like take like a few seconds. What is your mental cognition? What is it telling you? And I don't personally I don't know. Do we see being outside the health promoting behavior, the increased exercise? Is that because of the lowered stress, or is being outside and exercising and putting yourself in these natural spaces, does that then help your stress? Does it have to be the forest bathing in general? Or could just any outdoor exposure be good? It's a really interesting question to figure out. We're going to kind of go into that a little more here. So physical connection now. The physical benefits outdoors. Here, I'm not really mentioning a single article. I'm kind of just going back to some of the ones you mentioned in that last part about mental and kind of, you know, see some clear physical connections to physical health and nature. So close proximity to parks was correlated to better health. We saw that in that graph, where the highest or the lowest on the poor health was the ones that are closest to the park. Additionally, in that same study, a closer proximity to green space was correlated to exercising more. Those park visits, what are you doing a lot of times that you go to the park? You're walking, you're running, you're there, you're playing a game with your friends. All of those are exercise, and being close to a park then promotes you to exercise outdoors more. Um, Again, kind of going to greenness. Greenness has been shown to encourage physical activity, especially promote outside playtime in children, which is important, mentally and developmentally for children, but also really important physically. And that's kind of being in that greener neighborhood, which, having more access to parks, having more trees, having safe green space for children to be in is really, really important. Access to green space has also been shown to improve cardiovascular health. And practices like forest bathing can increase blood pressure and cortisol levels, which are both very important to your health. High blood pressure is very, very common and is not very good for you. But interestingly, none of these studies mention trees specifically as something outside of a component of green space. You'd say if you think of a forest, you do think of trees, but you know, it'd be interesting to see forest bathing done in a grassland or in a park that doesn't have a lot of trees, and kind of comparing and contrasting what the results are and seeing if the trees do play a role there. And in this case, none of those studies necessarily do that. These studies talk about green areas or like a green space is very much has trees in it. It's not trees itself. We don't want to connect green space and trees as the same. They're very different things. But it's important to, talk about these differences and look at these differences as what they are. And kind of moving on here, is our physical connection with trees anything more than correlation? So it's hard to quantify these relationships as a direct result of connection between humans and trees. Places like green spaces and forest areas contain a lot more than just trees, like I was just saying. Whether or not the trees are actually the culprit in things like forest bathing is a very, very difficult idea to manage. We don't know. It's hard. Maybe one day we'll know, but right now we don't. A lot of these benefits are mainly driven by personal choice. Sure, you can live. I said the example I use here is if 1,000 people live in 500 feet of a park, how many are going to choose to exercise there? If we build a house around a block of park, and we look at all these houses, how many of those people in those houses are making the choice to go out there, and how much of that is personal choice? There's a lot of bias and a lot of personal ideas that affect whether or not people are going to be going out there and whether or not they're going to actually do that. So sure, proximity increases their chances, but if they didn't live there, would they go outside in the first place? Or are these people that are going outside but because they're so close, go outside more and promote these exercising and healthy habits. And thirdly, many of these studies are not long term. We don't know the true benefits and how they present themselves in the long term until the future. This is a new field of study. We see, I think, what are those studies? They're 2016, 2019, 2014, which are like about 10 years ago now. But still, you know, those if you were 50 years old in that study, you're only 60 now. Maybe being outside and doing all these things are really, really, really good for you. But we don't really know the long-term effects until 20, 30 years from now when we get these kind of conclusion of these studies and some of these things can kind of come to complete fruition. Um, Next up, does exercising outside improve physical health? This is an interesting question. And we've not been able to find concrete evidence of any benefits to exercising outdoors when compared to indoors. There are very loose connections to decreased blood pressure and increased mood in exercising outdoors, similar to what we see with forest bathing. But ultimately, we run into a similar problem here as we have in the past. There's simply not enough overlap in found data to suggest that one is definitely better than the other. So we don't necessarily know. Is that running in the park better than running on a treadmill? Maybe. We can see these increased mood. And it also, again, it's very personal. If running on that park gives you motivation to run, then obviously it is better than you running on a treadmill. For me personally, I know that is how it is. I hate gyms. I hate treadmills. I like doing things outside. So that does encourage me to exercise, but I'm different than you. I'm different than everyone else. And we need to figure out here if there is a real connection or not. And it should be noted that when there are significantly or statistically significant differences, they always favor outdoor exercise versus indoor exercise. So many benefits displayed are simply those of consistent exercise, so we can concretely prove is beneficial. Obviously, exercise is a good thing. Whether or not it's indoor or outdoor remains to be seen how good that is. Again, the data points to outdoor might be a little bit better. And many trials in these studies are at risk of bias or have incomplete results in data. Again, a very similar problem we're running into in the last few sites we talked about. Now moving on to cultural connection. So here's like historical observations of trees. And looking back in history, we can find many examples of human connection to trees. We see tombs and ancient drawings are constantly filled with depictions of nature in Egypt and other countries like that. Many countries, for example, the Maori and the Navajo, believe that the souls of their ancestors are contained within trees. And cities documented throughout history have always contained parks and green spaces. And simply put, we want trees and natural spaces in our lives. These are natural things. These are what around us. And culturally, we can see that these are held to be important. Is there an explanation of this? Well, there is something called the biophilia hypothesis, and that's what it intends to achieve. We're going to get a little more into this here. The biophilia hypothesis, coined by Edward O. Wilson, states that humans have an inherent inclination to affiliate with nature. Basically, humans have the innate need to seek out nature and natural spaces. Edward O. Wilson, kind of one who coined this term, is very important. He's an American biologist, or was an American biologist and proponent of sociobiology. Sociobiology is a study of biological aspects of social behavior. So while teaching at Harvard, he wrote the book Biophilia, which suggested the idea that humans have a connection with nature and other species. If we follow the ideas and proofs presented by biophilia, then one could argue there is an innate connection between humans and natures, though this is simply observational. We can say this, we're going to move on with move along with this kind of idea that there is a connection between humans and nature. It's very important, kind of this study, and like kind of, if we ignored biophilia's existence and we said, oh, that's not real, it doesn't exist, um, it would kind of ruin it. There'd be no point to study human connection with trees. So obviously there is something here. Biophilia kind of explains this in a cultural and a more broad way. So kind of looking at this from a spiritual and religious angle, like I said before, trees are important spiritual and religious symbols in many cultures. Many Muslim and Druze villages have sacred trees or groves. Trees are historically common places of gathering. Those may be only due to shade. There's a possibility there that we look at back in history and we see trees and as gathering spots. Is that just because they gave shade from the hot sun, or is it because there's a deeper belief behind these trees? That, there is still study that needs to be done on that, and it is a very interesting anthropological question to answer. Druids in France and England believed the oak trees came directly from heaven, and similarly in Greek mythology, oak trees were the sacred tree of Zeus that he could speak through. And again, another oak tree example here. In many European cultures, oak trees are believed to be healers. Buddhists recognize trees as living things akin to humans and other animals. And religious symbols such as the tree of life are, as in many cultures, it's in Celtic cultures and Jewish culture. It's a very, very important symbol, and it's of course a tree. So this does kind of suggest that we do have spiritual and religious importance around trees and connection to trees in some ways. But there are some limitations here. Oftentimes, trees as religious symbols or religious contexts are not referring to physical trees, but instead using trees as a symbol. We're not like we're using these as like a symbol, the Star of David or the cross. These are symbols. They're not always referring to a physical thing. A tree is in many ways, and a lot of the Celtic symbols are simply just a symbol. They're not a tree. It's not talking about a physical tree. There's no there's no tree of life out there. Um, but it is a symbol that's important. And in Muslim cultures, sacred trees are treated the same as any other religious site, and there are no religious rituals actually pertaining to trees. So none of this is actually special to trees. None of it is exclusive to trees. There just is, you know, rituals that occur at these trees. And these cultures that worshipped oak trees are pretty antiquated now. There are no more druids in England and France. Greek mythology and Greek culture like that is long gone. So it's hard to know the exact role the oak tree played in these cultures. All of this points to say that human cultural connection in relationship to trees is no different than its basic connection to the natural world. They're simply an important symbol, but maybe not anything deeper than that. And while yes, there are cultures that observe to worship and connect to the natural world on a deeper level, made of native cultures and indigenous peoples, these cultures are either not widespread or innate enough to make it a generalization about human connection. And we don't see, native culture is sadly in some ways not the predominant culture here in America. It is not the culture we, naturally move towards. Uh, so that kind of it's hard to make generalization about human connection. We can make generalizations about these particular cultures. We can kind of talk about a deeper connection on cultural norms, but we can't necessarily say there's generalization about humans because there's no. If we look at general human culture, what we see in maybe the Western world or global South, neither of those kind of larger general cultures have these deeper connection to trees. So is spiritual connection even important then? Is analyzing spiritual connection important to science? And I'd argue yes, it's very important. Spiritual connection lets us use history and anthropology to study science, integrate indigenous knowledge into our research. It prevents helicopter research or kind of looking in on a culture, not involving them at all. And while spiritual connection might lack what we consider hard science, it's not talking about biology or chemistry, anything like that. It helps us form a holistic view of its opportunity, especially this one, not including indigenous and native and other cultures' perspectives is quite silly. We're looking for a holistic answer to this question. These are important views to take into account. So why does this all matter? And we see a picture there of the Santa Barbara coastline there. Um, not a lot of trees in that photo. There's one in the front, but we see a lot of the green brushland and small trees there. Um, so humans as creatures of nature. Humans are as much as part of the natural world as any other animal. We fit in as an important piece of the food cycle, and many of the natural cycles found in nature. A lot of that is sadly due to our, overexploitation and stuff like that. But we are there. We are the top of the food chain. We are important. And again, the biophilia hypothesis provides us with the idea that we naturally fit into nature. So does this then suggest that humans have a deeper connection with such a basic piece of nature as a tree? We'll go back to that question. But here's another important thing. So loss of open space. Open space is defined by the USDA as any undeveloped land, whether publicly or privately owned, no matter if it is protected or unprotected. Each day, an estimated 6,000 acres, almost 1 square mile, is lost and converted to other uses in America alone. The main kinds of open space lost each day are forests and grasslands. Therefore, we are constantly destroying trees to convert into urban spaces. There's a few questions, and just I want to add on there. It's not just urban spaces. There's also farmland and stuff like that. But urban spaces is a big part of it. Would humans knowingly destroy something we have a deep connection with in order to expand our own spaces? It's a very ethical question there. And would we do this the other way around? That is, destroy urban areas to restore urban open space and give back to nature. This is a process like regreening, which we'll talk about later. Um, and they're both really interesting ethical questions. You can't really answer them. It'd be very interesting to see, how everyone would answer these questions. They're all very different. Um, and it it does, it's a really interesting thought. If we see trees as this deeper connection, why would we destroy them? Why would we see that as something that we should do? We still do it. Is that ethical? Is that because, we see other reasons for that? And they transcend our connection, or is it just because there is no connection? So we talked about urbanization in the last slide. I'm going to talk about it a little more here. Urbanization's impact on natural exposure. So those living in more rural areas have increased access to nature and therefore increased exposure. Importantly, once a threshold of urbanization has been reached, think medium to large city, nature exposure is not shown to change. So when we talk about a medium-sized city and we talk about New York, interestingly, the nature exposure in those two is not significantly different, which is a testament, honestly, to humans building these cities and building cities that have green spaces as important parts. And once kind of this threshold has been reached, the main decider of natural exposure is one's attitude towards nature. How often we are going to go outside, how often we enjoy going outside. It's very, very important as the main decider there. And once urbanization has been achieved a further urbanization will not significantly affect natural exposure. So is urbanization good? Should we promote urbanization over increasing suburban areas? Yes and no. Urbanization can increase socialization and help promote human connection. It helps actually does help a lot of things as well. It can help with climate change. Urban area, like super condensed urban areas like New York City or like San Francisco, do have a lower carbon output. That's because of less reliance on cars. Um, and I think that we should definitely, to answer the second question, we should be promoting full urbanization over increasing suburban areas. Suburban areas are not great. They pollute heavily because they oftentimes rely on cars. They take up a lot more space. A single family home takes up a lot more space than an apartment building does, or multiple single family homes, sorry. Um, so I think as long as we are mindful with our nature and and the amount of green space we put into these urban areas, urbanization should be something that we promote. So what does this mean for trees and green space? Urbanization has many benefits to human population, as I was just saying. Decreased reliance on cars, reliance on walking, less overall land use, lower levels of pollution per capita. It is in the human interest to urbanize, but to include extensive green space in our cities is equally as important. Green space is in human interest. It fills human needs to nature's and outdoor exposure. It decreases air pollution, improves human health, and provides a space for de-stressing. All of those very, very important to what we do and are very, very important in general. So how does this all connect? So deforestation and physical health. This is pretty obvious. Taking it literally, less access to green space in and around human living areas leads to decreased time outdoors. Duh. It's the easiest thing I've said so far. Not living near green space. If you lived in a city and it was just a city, you would not go outside and you would not see nature because there is none of it there. And time spent outdoors is mainly physical or healthy. It's very hard to be outside and be doing something that is not healthy. Being outside in itself is healthy for you. Taking away large, untouched spaces of forest land makes practices like forest raiding nearly impossible. Privatization of land, which is a whole separate issue here, but it threatens hobbies that promote ecological health, birding, rock climbing, hiking, mountaineering, all of which promote physical health. And also, these are people that are going to care about the environment. They take care of the environment. Hikers and mountaineering and camping, you need protected green space to do those things. And they are, in turn, those people are going to care for that green space. Deforestation and mental health. A 2022 study relating percent of forestry area in 230 countries, which is Bolton, Monson, Gallo, you can find that in the sources, found that the forestry area is negatively associated with the presence of mental health disorders. Basically, the more forestry area a country has, the lower its prevalence of mental health disorders. For a 10% decrease in the portion of land converted by forestry area, the nation's prevalence of mental health and substance abuse disorders is decreased by 0.2 percentage points, which is pretty great. That seems like a clear connection to forest area and mental health. What do you think about the scale of this study? The study only shows baseline association at an extremely large countrywide scale. It is essentially a baseline that, if replicated on an individual level, could suggest that public health concerns could be a factor that needs to be taken into account when taking away forest areas. This is a very important study. It's a very good baseline, but hopefully we'll see this kind of research be, further put forward, and hopefully we can see that kind of be something that is shown on a really wide scale. Now we have some cultural effects of deforestation. Green spaces are often deeply important to many cultures and indigenous peoples. The Amazon rainforest has been home to the Amazon people for somewhere around 30,000 years. Deforestation has led to destruction of their traditional way of life, the exploitation of their natural resources and territories, and has put their religious and spiritual practices and beliefs at risk. Without the forest, they would simply not be able to live in a way that respected their culture and kept their practices alive. Ultimately, this is only one of thousands of examples of indigenous people being put at risk due to Western and colonial practices. Destroying habitat not only has an ecological impact, but a human cultural one as well. At the end of the day, it is simply another way to exploit those who are often the most exploited. So, how does this all connect? Trees are clearly important in some way to human beings. We've seen indigenous peoples and past societies have held trees as important. The suggestions of mental and physical health benefits caused by natural exposure. Our societies seek to build biophilic living spaces and workplaces. For example, Amazon, it's a horrible company as Amazon is, has an office that completely takes into account biophilic design. It's really important the way their office is designed. We naturally see places like parks as important and protected areas. Deforestation has proven effects past those that that are ecologically or climate based. But doesn't this ultimately suggest that we as human beings have a deep connection to trees that transcends our biophilic urges? And this is kind of where we come to this big issue with data. Um, while all true, the data in this presentation kind of suffers from one large logical fallacy, and that is cherry picking, which is the process of choosing evidence that only supports one's argument. Also, kind of comes a little bit in confirmation bias. When you research these kind of things and you research for connection, it oftentimes will get pushed articles that say yes or answer your question instead of kind of giving you more information on it. Um, they do definitely support the idea of a human-based selection of trees, and it relates to the original research question. Almost every single meta-analysis, literature review, and research paper listed, one can easily find counterexamples and arguments that support the idea that there's no deep connection between humans and trees. Many of these studies are extremely flawed, and many simply can't display information that supports either side consistently. A lot of these information will say, oh, there's a slight association this way, but we also see it go that way. We don't know. And I've talked about this a little bit earlier, but there is a big issue here where when we research this information, we look at this. So much what we look at, we search for connection. Or I did it for at least. Um, and there isn't necessarily a ton of information there. For every, especially when we talk about forest bathing or we talk about green space, both of those have very good examples of them not being very effective things. Um, Also, we don't know. The data can be followed both ways, make convincing arguments. I would argue it can definitely be followed a lot more in the way of there is a connection more than there isn't. But both ways have valid arguments, and a lot of it just suggests that we need to research more. So what does this kind of mean for the future? While human connection with trees remains uncertain, one thing remains completely clear. Protecting green space and forest land is more than just ecological interest. It is important for public health, physical and mental, biophilic needs, and spiritual and social connection. Looking at this issue from more angles than simply environmental shows the multifaceted impacts and importance of both the climate crisis and overexploitation of natural resources. If you take anything from this lecture, humans are important in both the causes and effects of deforestation. And I'm going to kind of give you a good thing to kind of get towards the end here, which is the process of regreening. And it's one of the best ways we can fight against deforestation. It involves replanting trees and forested space in areas that were previously deforested or destroyed by humans. For example, one of the great examples of this is urban greening, which is really important if we're going to increase urbanization, which is the incorporation of green spaces and biophilic design into cities where it was previously lacking. On the right here, you're going to see a picture of the Highline Park in New York, which is what we'll talk about in a second. Again, so this builds more parks and green spaces for humans to use, which is a good thing for mental and physical health. And this is a Highline Park, which is a converted space that previously was quite far from green space into a park for local residents to enjoy. It's been going for about 15 years now. It's really important. It's something that can kind of be taken by a lot of other cities as a great example of how you can take non-green space and turn it into green space to make it a great place for people to be outdoors in an environment where maybe that wouldn't be as easy to find. Um, it helps us also continue studying urban green spaces. It also helps fight something called the urban heat sink effect, which is where the concrete in these cities get kind of taken heat and it's not good. But having more plants and green spaces can fight that. It also helps fight air pollution because, obviously. So answering the initial question here, it's hard to simply pass an observational connection. Complex quantifiable connections still needs to be researched. Yeah, we know there is a biophilic connection between humans and the natural world. We don't know how or if this connection extends to trees or what role they play. We know that deforestation has adverse effects on humans, both mentally and physically. And we know the most important thing here is trees are important. Just so much so remains to be seen by further research. And how could this research continue? These are just a few ideas. Research into trees as separate pieces of green space, finding concrete evidence of mental health connections with trees, further exploring biophilic needs and further understanding human connection to nature, figuring out what roles trees play in urbanization, and continue research on forest bathing, outdoor exercise, continuations of long-term information on, you know, the effects of green space and stuff like that. It's all really, really important, and it all should be continued going. Remember, this is not just an ecological climate issue, it is a human issue, and that report should be important to research and continue researching on and on and on. And yeah, that is the end of this lecture and presentation. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.